She's just a burden, Your Honor. My daughter's voice rang through the courtroom like it belonged there, steady and practiced, as if she had rehearsed that line in front of a mirror more than once. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the polished wooden table in front of me, tracing the faint scratches that caught the overhead lights. The room was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and stayed there. People shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. A pen clicked somewhere behind me. And still, I said nothing. At 68, I had learned the power of silence. It had carried me through sleepless nights, through hospital waiting rooms, through years of putting someone else's needs before my own. Today, it would have to carry me through this. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blazer, the same one I had worn to my husband's memorial service 5 years ago. It still fit. That surprised me. Not everything had changed, I suppose. Mrs. Collins, the judge said, his voice calm, neutral, the way voices are when they don't belong to your life. You'll have a chance to respond. I nodded once, a small motion, controlled. I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Strangers. Clerks. Attorneys. People who didn't know that I used to braid my daughter's hair before school, that I packed her lunches in brown paper bags with little notes, folded inside. They didn't know the sound of her laughter when she was 8, or how she used to reach for my hand crossing the street. To them, I was just another case file. Another name printed on paper. Emily shifted beside her attorney, her heels clicking softly as she crossed one leg over the other. She didn't look at me either. That, more than anything, felt deliberate. Like a choice. Like a line she had drawn and decided not to cross. She hasn't contributed financially in years. Her attorney continued, smooth and confident. My client has been solely responsible for the property, the maintenance, the taxes, everything. The words floated in the air, clean and organized, stripped of history. I let them sit there. I let them settle. The courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. It reminded me of early mornings, of routines, of a life that once made sense. I folded my hands in my lap. They were steady. That surprised me too. I thought they might shake. I thought something inside me might crack open and spill out right here, in front of all these strangers. But nothing did. Not yet. Ms. Carter, the judge said, turning his attention to Emily. You're claiming full ownership of the residence in question? Yes, Your Honor, she replied without hesitation. Her voice was clear. Certain. The kind of certainty that comes from believing you're right, or from needing to believe it. I inhaled slowly, letting the air fill my lungs, then exhaled just as slowly. The ceiling lights hummed softly above us. Time felt stretched, like it had thinned out, each second pulling longer than it should. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides, but I didn't push back. I didn't argue. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I sat there, listening to my own daughter describe me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into her life and overstayed my welcome. She's been living there out of convenience, Emily added, her tone sharpening just slightly. But legally, the house is mine. Convenience. The word lingered. I turned it over in my mind, the way you turn over something fragile, trying to understand where it cracked. I thought about the years. The birthdays. The quiet dinners. The mornings I woke before sunrise to make sure everything was ready before she stepped out the door. Convenience. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was simple. Too simple. And somewhere in that simplicity, something didn't fit. I lifted my gaze then, just slightly, enough to see the judge more clearly. His expression hadn't changed. Not yet. But there was a pause in the room, subtle, almost imperceptible. Like a breath being held. And for the first time since Emily spoke, I felt it. Not anger. Not sadness. Something else. Something quieter. A shift. By noon that same day, the house no longer felt like a place I lived in, but something I was passing through, like a waiting room where nothing truly belonged to me anymore. I moved slowly from one room to the next, not searching for anything in particular, just looking, as if I needed to confirm that everything was still where I had left it. The living room was exactly the same. The same cream-colored sofa, the same framed photographs on the mantel, the same faint scent of lavender from the candle I lit every Sunday evening. I paused in front of one of the photos, a picture of Emily at 12 years old, holding a certificate with both hands, her smile wide and unguarded. I remembered that day clearly. I had taken off work early, driven across town in the middle of traffic just to make it in time. She had scanned the crowd until she found me, and when she did, her shoulders relaxed, like she had been waiting for that moment. I reached out but stopped just before touching the frame. Some things felt different when you touched them. Some truths settled deeper. Instead, I let my hand fall back to my side and continued walking. The hallway felt longer than usual. Or maybe I was just moving slower. I passed the guest room, the door slightly open, the bed neatly made. It had been months since anyone had used it. Emily had not stayed overnight in a long time. She always had a reason. Work. Traffic. Plans. There was always something. At the end of the hallway was my bedroom. I stepped inside and stood near the doorway, not fully entering, just observing. The bed was made, the sheets pulled tight, the pillows arranged the way I had always arranged them. On the dresser sat a small wooden box, one I had not opened in years. I walked over to it and lifted the lid carefully. Inside were documents, old letters, things I had kept not because I needed them, but because they belonged to a time when things were simpler. My fingers hovered over the papers, then settled on one envelope, slightly worn at the edges. I did not open it. Not yet. I closed the box and returned it to its place. Some answers do not come from looking backward. They come from understanding what is in front of you. I went back to the kitchen and sat down again at the table, the folded notice still resting where I had left it. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting a longer shadow across the surface. Time had moved forward, even if I had not. I unfolded the paper once more and read it again, this time focusing on the details I had ignored before. Dates. Signatures. References. It was all there, laid out in a way that suggested preparation, intention. This was not sudden. This had been building. Quietly. Carefully. I thought about the conversations we had not had. The questions I had not asked. The moments I had chosen silence instead of curiosity. Not because I did not care, but because I trusted that what we had did not need to be questioned. That trust sat with me now, heavier than the paper in my hands. I leaned back slightly in my chair, exhaling slowly, letting the air leave my lungs in a controlled, measured way. There was no urgency in my movements, no panic in my thoughts. Just a steady realization forming, piece by piece. Outside, the sky was clear, the kind of blue that usually made everything feel possible. Today, it felt distant. I folded the paper again, more precisely this time, aligning each edge with care, then placed it in the center of the table. I looked at it for a long moment before standing up. There were things I needed to do. Not to fight. Not yet. But to understand. Because whatever had been written into that document did not begin on that page. It had started long before, in small choices, in quiet omissions, in things I had seen but not fully understood. And now, standing there in my own kitchen, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else. I had not lost my place in that house overnight. I had been moved slowly, carefully, without noise, until one day, I was no longer at the center of it at all. That afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the small wooden box again, the one I had closed too quickly earlier, as if it held something I was not ready to face, but now the silence of the house pressed in closer, urging me to look more carefully, to stop avoiding what had been sitting there all along. I carried the box to the kitchen table and set it down beside the folded notice, the two objects resting side by side like they belonged to the same story, even though they came from entirely different times. I opened the lid slowly this time, without hesitation, and let my fingers move through the contents with more intention, not just brushing past them, but actually seeing them. There were old birthday cards, some with glitter still clinging to the edges, others with handwriting that had grown more mature over the years, each one signed with love that once felt uncomplicated. I set them aside carefully, forming a small stack to my left. Beneath them were folded letters, documents, and envelopes, all kept in order, not because I expected to need them, but because I had always believed that keeping things organized was a way of keeping life stable. I paused when I reached a thicker envelope, one that felt different from the rest. It was addressed in a familiar handwriting, my husband's, steady and deliberate, the way he wrote everything important. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle into my palm, then opened it with a slow, careful motion. Inside were several pages, neatly typed, along with a copy of a document I recognized immediately, though I had not looked at it in years. I sat down, bringing the papers closer, and began to read. The language was formal, precise, but beneath it was something else, something I could recognize even through the legal phrasing. Intention. Protection. I remembered the day we signed those documents, sitting across from a lawyer in a quiet office, sunlight filtering through tall windows, my husband's hand resting lightly over mine as he assured me that everything was being put in place for the future, not just for us, but for Emily as well. At the time, it had felt like planning, like responsibility. Now, it felt like something more deliberate, something designed to hold firm even when everything else shifted. I read through the pages again, slower this time, paying attention to every detail, every clause, every name. The structure was clear. The ownership of the house was not as simple as it had been presented in the notice. It had never been just one person's claim. There were conditions, protections, requirements that had to be met, all outlined carefully, as if someone had anticipated the possibility of confusion, or perhaps even conflict. I placed the papers down gently, aligning them with the edge of the table, then leaned back slightly in my chair. The room was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. There was something else now, something that had not been there before. Not relief. Not yet. But clarity. I looked at the notice again, then at the documents beside it, seeing them not as separate pieces, but as parts of the same picture that had been incomplete until now. Outside, the light had shifted again, the afternoon beginning to soften into early evening, casting longer shadows across the floor. I rested my hands on the table, steady, grounded, and allowed myself a moment to simply sit with what I had discovered. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a simple mistake. It was a narrative that had been built carefully, presented with confidence, and accepted without question, until now. I did not feel the need to rush, to call anyone, to confront anything immediately. Instead, I gathered the documents together, placing them neatly back into the envelope, then into the box, but this time I did not push it away. I left it there, within reach, a quiet reminder that not everything had been taken from me, not everything had been rewritten beyond recognition. Some things had been preserved, waiting patiently to be seen again. And as I sat there in the fading light, I understood something that settled deep within me, steady and unshaken. The story that had been told about me was not the whole story. And for the first time since the knock on my door that morning, I knew that when the moment came, I would not need to raise my voice to be heard. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, the way I used to when Emily was still living at home, when mornings had a rhythm that felt necessary, purposeful, something that held the day together before it even began. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, as if it were waiting to see what I would do next. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the stillness settle into something steady instead of uncertain. Then I sat up, placed my feet on the floor, and stood without hesitation. There was no rush in my movements, no sense of urgency, just a quiet decision forming with each step I took. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee again, measuring the grounds with the same care as always, but this time I noticed everything more clearly. The sound of the water heating. The faint hum of the refrigerator. The way the light entered through the window and stretched across the counter. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I brought the mug to the table and sat down, the wooden box already there, exactly where I had left it. I opened it again, not out of doubt, but out of certainty. The documents inside were the same, the words unchanged, the meaning just as clear as it had been the night before. I read them one more time, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because I wanted to understand them fully, to let every detail settle into place so that nothing could be taken out of context, nothing could be reshaped into something it was not. When I finished, I did not put them back immediately. Instead, I placed them neatly beside my coffee, aligning the edges, keeping everything in order. It was a small act, but it felt important. Outside, the street was beginning to come alive, the distant sound of cars, a neighbor's door closing, the quiet movement of a world continuing forward. I took a sip of my coffee, still warm this time, and allowed myself to sit with the thought that had been forming since the night before. This was not about proving anything. It was not about correcting a misunderstanding or defending myself against something untrue. It was about something simpler, something quieter. It was about standing still while everything else moved, and letting the truth reveal itself without force. I thought about the courtroom, the way Emily had spoken, the confidence in her voice, the certainty that everything would go as she expected. I did not feel anger when I thought of it. Not anymore. That had passed some time during the night, replaced by something steadier, something that did not need to rise or fall with anyone else's words. I gathered the documents carefully, placing them into a clean envelope, one without marks or folds, something that reflected the clarity of what they contained. I sealed it, not because it needed to be hidden, but because it needed to be held intact, unchanged, until the right moment. Then I placed it back into the box and closed the lid gently. The house felt different now, not because anything had been restored, but because something had been understood. I stood up, carried my empty mug to the sink, and rinsed it slowly, watching the water move over the surface, clear and steady. There was a calm in that motion, something that mirrored the quiet shift inside me. I dried my hands, turned off the faucet, and looked around the kitchen one more time. Everything was in its place. Everything as it should be. And for the first time since the envelope had been placed in my hand, I realized that I was not preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to let something unfold exactly as it was meant to, without interruption, without resistance, knowing that when the moment came, I would not need to say much at all for everything to change. Back in the courtroom, the air felt heavier than before, not louder, not more chaotic, but denser, as if every word spoken had begun to settle into the walls themselves, refusing to disappear. I remained seated, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged, even as the conversation around me continued to move forward without pause. Emily's attorney spoke with the same measured confidence, presenting statements as though they had already been accepted as truth, each sentence carefully placed, each claim delivered with a certainty that did not invite interruption. I listened. Not to respond, not to challenge, but to understand how the narrative had been shaped so completely without my voice. "The property has been maintained exclusively by my client," he said, his tone even, professional. "All financial responsibilities have been assumed by her for several years." I let the words pass through the space between us, noting the way they sounded when spoken aloud, stripped of context, stripped of memory. Around me, a few people shifted in their seats again, the quiet movement of observers adjusting to the flow of the case. I could feel their attention moving, not fixed, not committed, simply following wherever the strongest voice led. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Emily more clearly. She sat upright, her expression composed, her gaze directed forward, never once drifting in my direction. There was a stillness in her that looked like control, but something about it felt practiced, like a posture she had learned rather than something that came naturally. I remembered a time when her expressions were not so guarded, when her thoughts appeared on her face before she could hide them. That version of her felt distant now, almost unfamiliar. "Mrs. Collins," the judge said again, his voice cutting gently through the room, not sharp, not forceful, but enough to draw a line of attention back toward me. "Do you have anything you would like to add at this time?" I lifted my gaze fully then, meeting his eyes for the first time since the hearing began. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation, just an openness that allowed for an answer without demanding one. I held that moment for a second longer than necessary, then shook my head once, calmly. "Not at this time, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, clear, carrying just enough to be heard without needing to be raised. A brief pause followed. It was subtle, but it was there, a slight shift in the rhythm of the room, as if something had not gone exactly as expected. Emily's attorney glanced down at his notes, then continued, adjusting his tone slightly, reinforcing his earlier statements with additional details, numbers, dates, references that sounded precise but felt incomplete. I noticed then, for the first time, the small inconsistencies, not obvious, not enough to disrupt the flow, but present, like faint lines beneath a polished surface. A date that did not align perfectly. A phrasing that suggested assumption rather than fact. The kind of details that did not stand out unless you were looking for them. I did not react. I did not lean forward or interrupt. I simply listened, allowing those details to settle in my mind, forming a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken yet. The judge made a small note on the paper in front of him, his pen moving briefly before stopping again. His expression remained neutral, but there was something different now, something almost imperceptible, a slight narrowing of focus, as if he were beginning to look more closely at what was being presented. The room continued as before, the voices steady, the structure intact, but beneath it, something had begun to shift. It was not visible to everyone. Not yet. But I could feel it, the same way you feel a change in the air before anything actually moves. I adjusted my hands slightly, resting them more firmly against each other, grounding myself in that stillness. There was no need to hurry. No need to correct anything immediately. Because the more clearly they spoke, the more completely they revealed the shape of what they had built. And for the first time since I had walked into that room, I understood that the strength of their certainty was not something to fight against. It was something to let unfold, piece by piece, until the moment came when it could no longer hold itself together. The room had settled into a rhythm that felt almost predictable, voices rising and falling in measured turns, papers shifting, the quiet scrape of chairs against the floor, everything moving forward as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere outside of this space. I remained still, my attention fixed not on the words themselves, but on the spaces between them, the pauses that revealed more than the statements ever could. Emily's attorney continued, his tone unwavering, building his case with the same steady cadence, but now I could hear it differently, not as a complete story, but as something assembled, something arranged to appear seamless. As documented, he said, tapping lightly on a stack of papers, all financial contributions toward the residence have been made by my client since the year noted here. He slid the document forward slightly, positioning it where it could be seen clearly, his gesture confident, deliberate. The judge leaned forward just enough to acknowledge it, his eyes scanning the page briefly before returning to a neutral position. But this time, he did not move on immediately. There was a pause, small but distinct, as if something had caught his attention, something that did not align as easily as the rest. I noticed the way his fingers rested on the edge of the paper, not turning it, not dismissing it, simply holding it there. Emily shifted slightly beside her attorney, her posture tightening just a fraction, a movement so subtle it could have been overlooked if you were not watching closely. I did not move. I did not react. I simply observed, allowing the moment to stretch without interference. The attorney continued, filling the space with more details, more references, but the rhythm had changed. It was no longer as smooth, no longer as controlled. There was a slight adjustment in his pacing, a careful selection of words where before there had been certainty. The judge lowered his gaze again, this time more slowly, returning to the document in front of him. His pen moved once, making a brief notation, then stopped. He lifted the page, turning it over, then back again, comparing something that had not been mentioned aloud. The room seemed to quiet without instruction, the natural movement of attention drawing inward, focusing on the shift that had begun to take shape. I could feel it now, not just within myself, but in the space around us, a subtle change in direction, like a current beginning to turn beneath still water. Emily's eyes flickered toward the document for the first time, her expression tightening just enough to reveal something beneath the surface, something that had not been there before. It was not fear. Not yet. But it was no longer certainty. The judge leaned back slightly, his gaze lifting from the paper, moving slowly across the room before settling, not on the attorney, not on the documents, but on me. The moment held, quiet and suspended, as if everything else had stepped aside to make space for it. I met his gaze without hesitation, not with expectation, not with urgency, simply with the same calm that had carried me through every moment leading up to this one. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked down once more, his hand moving to a second document, one that had not been presented, one that had been part of the file from the beginning. He compared the two briefly, his expression unchanged, but the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It had weight now. He placed both papers down carefully, aligning them with precision, then rested his hands on the bench in front of him. The room remained still, waiting, though no one had been told to. And in that stillness, I understood that something had finally reached the surface, something that could no longer be arranged or explained away. I adjusted my posture slightly, not to prepare, not to respond, but simply to remain present as the moment unfolded. Because this was not the kind of shift that required force. It was the kind that revealed itself fully only when everything else had been allowed to speak first. And now, with nothing left to add, the silence itself had begun to say what words could not. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like something heavy being moved just out of sight, and when the judge finally spoke, his voice was not louder than before, but it carried differently, as if every word had been weighed before it was allowed into the room. "Counsel," he said, his eyes still resting on the documents in front of him. "Can you clarify this date?" It was a simple question, almost routine, but the way it settled into the space made it feel like more than that. Emily's attorney responded quickly, his tone still composed, offering an explanation that sounded complete on the surface, referencing timelines, adjustments, standard procedures. I listened without turning my head, my focus steady, because I could hear it now, the slight strain beneath the confidence, the effort it took to keep the narrative intact. The judge nodded once, but did not move on. Instead, he lifted the second document again, the one that had not been presented, the one that had been there all along. He held it beside the first, comparing them with a precision that did not rush, did not skip ahead. The room remained still, not because it had been instructed to, but because no one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. "And this signature," the judge continued, his voice even. "Can you confirm its origin?" There was a pause this time, brief but noticeable. Emily's attorney glanced down, then toward his client, then back to the bench, adjusting his stance slightly before answering. "Yes, Your Honor, that is consistent with the documents provided at the time of transfer." His words were clear, but they did not land the same way they had before. Something had shifted. The judge's gaze lifted slowly, moving from the papers to Emily, holding there for a moment that stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable, then returning to me. It was not an expression of judgment. Not yet. But it was no longer neutral. It was focused. Deliberate. "Mrs. Collins," he said, and this time there was a slight change in his tone, not in volume, but in weight, as if the words carried something beneath them. I did not speak immediately. I simply looked at him, steady, present, allowing the moment to settle before responding. "Yes, Your Honor," I said quietly. He nodded once, then gestured lightly toward the documents in front of him. "These records indicate a structure that differs from what has been presented today." He paused, his eyes moving briefly back to the page, then up again. "Specifically, they suggest that the authority over this property was not transferred in the manner described." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the room with a finality that did not require repetition. I could feel the shift fully now, not just in the judge, but in the space around us, the subtle change in attention, the quiet recalibration of what was being understood. Emily's posture changed again, her shoulders tightening, her gaze no longer fixed forward but drawn toward the documents, as if seeing them for the first time in a way she had not expected. Her attorney began to respond, his tone careful, attempting to clarify, to adjust, but the rhythm had broken. The structure he had built no longer held in the same way. I remained still, my hands resting lightly together, my breathing even, because there was nothing I needed to add. The truth did not require urgency. It did not need to be forced into the conversation. It had simply appeared quietly in the space that had been left open long enough for it to be seen. The judge leaned back slightly, his hands coming together in front of him, the documents aligned neatly on the bench. "It appears," he said, his voice calm, measured, "that the primary authority rests with her." He did not raise his hand. He did not point. But his gaze moved to me, clear and unmistakable. And in that moment, the room understood what had changed, even if no one spoke it aloud. I did not react. I did not shift in my seat or allow any visible response to surface. I simply held that moment, the way I had held every other, quietly, without interruption, because everything that needed to be said had already been revealed without me having to say a single word. No one spoke for a moment after that, not because they had been told to remain silent, but because there was nothing left that could be said without acknowledging what had already been revealed. The air in the courtroom felt different now, not heavy, not tense, but settled, as if something that had been unsettled for a long time had finally found its place. I remained seated, my hands still resting lightly together, my posture unchanged, even as the understanding in the room shifted around me. Emily's attorney adjusted his stance, his papers no longer aligned with the same precision as before, his voice quieter when he attempted to respond, offering explanations that no longer carried the same certainty. The structure he had relied on had already begun to dissolve, not dramatically, not with resistance, but simply because it could not hold against what had been quietly presented. Emily did not speak. She sat still, her gaze lowered now, no longer fixed ahead, her expression no longer composed in the way it had been at the beginning. There was no outburst, no visible collapse, just a subtle absence of the certainty that had once defined her presence. I looked at her for a brief moment, not with accusation, not with triumph, but with a kind of clarity that did not require emotion to be understood. Then I looked away. The judge gathered the documents in front of him, aligning them with careful precision, before placing them to the side. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if ensuring that everything was in its proper place before continuing. "Based on the documentation reviewed," he said, his voice calm and steady, "the claim as presented does not reflect the established authority over the property." He paused briefly, allowing the statement to settle, then continued. "Further review will proceed in accordance with the original structure outlined in these records." There was no need for elaboration. The meaning was clear. I felt no surge of relief, no sudden release of tension, just a quiet confirmation of what had already become evident. I placed my hands on the edge of the table and stood slowly, not in reaction, not in response, but simply because it was time to move. The chair shifted softly behind me as I stepped away from it, the sound blending into the stillness of the room. No one stopped me. No one needed to. I gathered my coat from the back of the chair, smoothing the fabric with a small, familiar motion, then turned toward the aisle. The courtroom remained quiet as I walked, the soft sound of my steps steady against the floor, each one measured, unhurried. I did not look back immediately. I did not search for expressions or reactions. Instead, I moved forward, focusing only on the path in front of me, the exit just a few steps away. When I reached the door, I paused briefly, my hand resting on the handle, and for a moment, I allowed myself to look back, not at the judge, not at the attorney, but at Emily. She remained seated, her posture unchanged, her gaze still lowered, as if she were looking at something that no longer existed in the way she had believed it did. I did not speak. There was nothing to say that would add to what had already been understood. Instead, I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the light there softer, the air quieter, carrying none of the weight that had filled the room behind me. The door closed gently, the sound final but not harsh, simply marking the end of something that had already concluded. I stood there for a moment, allowing the stillness to settle around me, then adjusted my coat once more and began to walk. There was no urgency in my steps, no need to rush toward anything or away from it. Because what I had lost had not been taken from me in that room, and what I had gained did not need to be announced. It was enough to know, with a clarity that did not waver, that I had not been diminished, not by words, not by claims, not by the quiet ways in which I had been moved aside. I had simply been seen, finally, for what had always been true, and that was something no one could take away again.